Kevin, your ministry is over.
Brother Kevin heard those words after working for nearly a decade in the People's Republic of China. Last week, we heard how God clearly called Kevin and his family to go. So as life in communist China grew more and more restrictive for believers, this declaration from ministry leaders was very difficult to process.
It's time for you to go ahead and get your family and leave so you can live to fight another day.
Jesus never promised his followers an easy path. In fact, he told his disciples that the world would hate them. He sent them out as sheep among wolves. Jesus' words came true in the life of the apostles, and they're still coming true today in the lives of his followers around the world. Join host Todd Nettleton as we hear their inspiring stories and learn how we can help. Right now on the Voice of the Martyrs Radio Network.
Welcome again to the Voice of the Martyrs Radio. My name is Todd Nettleton. Last week, we began a conversation with a gospel worker. Mostly last week, he talked about his call to ministry. For his security, we are just using one name, as we often do here on VOM Radio, and we're disguising Brother Kevin's voice. Kevin told us about being called to the Hui people. This group represented about 13 million people. Most of them are Muslims. There were only a few hundred believers among this group and 0 gospel workers. Kevin had a job as a teacher in China, and he and his family worked among the Hui people for several years. Kevin, you mentioned the involvement of the authorities in your time in China. What did that look like for you as a foreigner?
As we got into our second and third neighborhoods and areas, I began to realize, these are just common people that have the same needs, desires, responsibilities that I have. And I just began I would pop in and see them without them inviting me sometimes. I would walk with them through the neighborhood or through the campus. You also have to remember, I have children that I think most people would say are really cute. And so they were very disarming. I would often take one of my kids out to go prayer walking with me. And there would be an intimidating looking force of law enforcement personnel in our area, but they would generally be disarmed by my small children. So I tried to view these individuals as people that were worthy of my respect, and that they were people who were worthy of my compassion, not my resistance. And there were a few occasions where somebody wanted to be in an adversarial exchange with me. Often who I would look back to would be the Puritans, actually. When a team leader asked me one time, what's a good resource for being a good team leader? I said, Fox's Book of Martyrs. You don't know what loving your enemies looks like until you see the Puritans do it, who stand in the fire and give their shoes away to the onlookers. Things like that were in my mind, and I didn't want to view the police as people that were calculating and strategic. They're just people who are trying to be obedient and protect their livelihood. And so I tried to treat them that way. And generally it went pretty well. And so a lot of times the authorities would ask me a question about who I knew, and I might talk about the challenges of being a foreigner in their lovely city. I would rather talk about that than talk about the details of a friend of mine or something like that. And some of them would be persistent. They might circle back around I wasn't really asking you about that. I want to know about this person. Yeah, and I would say, I know him. He probably came here about the same time I did. And it's been such a blessing for us to raise our kids together in the same city, and for our kids to get a really good cross-cultural experience as they're growing up, and just try to talk about things like that. I don't really want to talk about the details of his life, so I would just talk about other things kind of ancillary.
So let's talk about a Hui person leaves Islam behind. They decide, this Jesus is true, this is real, I'm going to follow Jesus. What happens to them? What does persecution look like for them?
It was typically social and psychological, and sometimes financial. We saw almost no elderly people come to Christ. Those Muslims were pretty well dug in. I was working with a 70-something-year-old man who died while I was working with him. I think he was getting close though, and I didn't see him for the last couple of weeks of his life, and so I'm not really sure what happened. But other than him, everybody was under 40. So that meant that they were still under the authority of their parents to some degree, especially if they were single. Typically, each family has a local imam who maybe he can be aggressive, he can get himself involved in the situation, or he might not. That could go either way. But almost every family has an uncle. I say an uncle, it's just a relative who's the enforcer. And that person's job, he's usually not a healthy person mentally or socially, and he can flip the proverbial switch and go into really aggressive mode, can be violent, and knows how to make the kinds of threats that are really persuasive to people. So those would include things like job loss, being kicked out of the family, no longer being a son or daughter or brother or sister in that family. It could even be pretty twisted, like putting pressure on your loved ones if you don't recant, that sort of thing. So typically it would be that sort of psychological pressure. It would be more concrete in the countryside, more physical, and but in the cities it would tend to be.
And how much of that is driven by, I'm a devout Muslim and now you're an apostate, versus everyone's going to know, and our family's going to be ashamed of you now?
Yeah, it would be more the latter thing,
Okay.
more face-oriented, socially oriented. You are embarrassing us. You are a traitor. They would use the word pantu. You are a traitor, and you are bringing shame on our family. It is my job to bring you back into line, in a sense. The imams would be a little bit more driven by, more theological or religious motives, but even they would see it as a shameful thing. You have to understand, like, the word Hui Jiao in Chinese, what you saw me say Hui, like, that's the word for Islam. To be Hui is to be Muslim.
Oh, wow.
And so there's not another category. Like, you've broken the categories by being something other than a Muslim. So it's considered to be a deep insult to your ethnic group to do that.
How does the Chinese government, which we know from what's happening with the Uyghurs, we know they don't trust Muslims. How do they see somebody coming to a Muslim and talking about Jesus? They don't trust the church either. How does the Chinese government respond to efforts to do gospel work among some of the Muslim people groups in China?
Our sense of the government in China is, again, I think one that we've had to prayerfully seek God about, because, again, there is a tendency to be really harsh toward the government, again, as being an integrated system of calculating, deceitful, godless individuals who are out to get good people or something like that. And again, my experience with government workers is they're trying to be obedient to who's above them. And I think oftentimes they have to do things against their conscience because they want to be able to put bread on the table for their family. And it's an impossible situation for them. The government in China, my sense of it is, I'm frustrated by the fact that they're not really that worried about the power of the gospel. I feel like they should be, but they just don't seem worried about that. When you're coming from an atheistic perspective, it's like you see people that believe in a faith as being similar to what you are. It's just my faith is the Communist Party. And so that really changes the way you view a Christian or a Muslim background believer, that they're just, in a sense, they're shifting philosophies from one to the other. They don't have an understanding of a new birth, not in that way. And so our sense was that the government wasn't super afraid of the power of the gospel. What they do care about, two things: allegiance and peace. When you have a country with 1.4 billion people, societal unrest is a major concern.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really more what the concern was with people like us. So I would see it two ways. One is, Kevin, we don't want you going out into the countryside. And then I would think, I'll fill in the blank. You don't want me going out there because the whole village will come to Christ. No, they're afraid I'll get killed out there and there will be a scandal in the world news, something like that, right?
And then they'll get fired because they were supposed to keep the foreigners alive.
Exactly. So there was that. And then in the cities, it would be more, we don't want you going into that neighborhood and talking about the gospel, because if one of those people believes it, the uncles and the imams will get upset and they might do something that will cause a disturbance. We want peace. We want status quo.
Yeah, stability.
Yeah, even if they don't believe in the communist system, that's okay, as long as there's peace and stability. So they would see us as a threat to stability, not so much an ideological threat.
We're talking this week on Voice of the Martyrs Radio with Brother Kevin. He has served for more than a decade among a predominantly Muslim group in China. Kevin, how did your time in China come to a close? What was going on in your heart of that sense of calling that you still have, and yet now I can't be here anymore?
Yeah. I think most of us know that starting with Xi Jinping's ascent, things begin to slowly and then really rapidly change. 2017 was a really key year. I just remember a lot of the foreign friends that we had who were serving as teachers or small businessmen, but who also know the Lord and wanted to make him known there. They started having trouble getting their visas renewed. And as we got into 2018, there just weren't that many of us left in the province where we were. And basically we got into 2018, and the Chinese government began to get more systematic about re-educating some of the Muslim minorities. And we were geographically situated in a very inconvenient place for that. And so it became pretty clear, first through them just being indirect and not renewing visas, but then more direct near the end that they didn't really want us to be there. I think having firsthand witnesses to what was going on, or us knowing local families who had a person in their family experience what was going on, was not something that they wanted to get out. At least they didn't want us creating the narrative about that. Things got pretty tense in our last few weeks there. And maybe about 2 days before everything fell apart, by God's grace, we began to see like maybe I needed to create a little bit of a runway. And so I did that. I talked to my employer and I told them the truth, which was that I had 2 relatives back in the States who were about to have surgery. And I just told them that and asked them what they thought I should do. I talked to 4 people, and 3 of them said, maybe you should think about flying back to be with them. And I said, that's a good idea. But the most important person did not say that and said something more like, I hope you're not thinking about going anywhere because you've got responsibilities here, that sort of thing. So anyway, sure enough, about 48 hours later, things got pretty tense in our area. We saw more targeted efforts by the authorities to find legal reasons to either detain or deport us and our partners. You have some really interesting conversations with your spouse in those situations, like when I said, I'm not leaving, and my wife said, okay, I have heard you tell groups of elders and local leaders before that if they are ever in the room with the decision makers and everybody else in the room is saying we need to take path A, and you are the only one that's advocating for path B, you might be wrong. She said, you've said that, right? And I said, yes. She said, well, can we at least be open to the fact that we need wise counsel, and if we find that you are in the minority, you will recognize that maybe you're wrong. And I said, yeah, sure. So in a matter of hours, we got some good wise counsel from our field leadership, from organizational leadership, from individuals that we know who are well connected with the bigger things going on, as well as a few folks that were being detained at the time. Some of them said it would be easier for the rest of us if you would just leave. Others said harder things like, Kevin, your ministry is over. it's time for you to go ahead and get your family and leave so you can live to fight another day. So in a matter of hours, it became clear every wise counselor was saying go, and I was the only one saying, I'm not leaving. And I submitted to that. We bought airline tickets at 11 p.m. We woke up our kids at 2 a.m. and said, pack your stuff. It's time to go. And our kids said, when are we coming back? And we said, we're not. Just pack what you can carry and we'll head out. And the Lord opened the door. Several checkpoints were not manned at the time. And the big one that we knew would get us hung up, for whatever reason, our driver didn't stop. He just ran it. And the security officer wasn't looking and didn't throw up any kind of a fuss. So made it to the airport and were able to get out. I have no doubt that they were aware of it. I think that for whatever reason, they were starting to get the sense that we were not the kind of threat that they thought we were, and that we were actually there to love people and to do good to them. We just had we're coming from a different angle on that. I think if they wanted to keep me there, they could have.
We had a conversation on Voice of the Martyrs Radio, and I would encourage you, if you're listening, to find it in our podcast stream, find it on our website with Richard and Jeanette. They went through a similar experience, except Richard was detained by the authorities and spent several days being interrogated, very difficult time for them. Kevin, how did you process that spiritually of, hey, I have this sense of call? Was there some questioning of God? Like, how could you let this happen? Because you called me here. Or was it a sense of peace that, no, I've still got you? Or a little bit of both?
Yeah. I mean, I think it was a complex of a lot of different thoughts and emotions. I think what might be more helpful in answering your question is, at the time this happened, I was connected with a couple of dozen other units and was able to see how all of them were responding to it. And there was a lot of questioning of God. For what it's worth, I do think your theological perspective probably plays a role in how you process this sort of thing. And I come from a more Reformed perspective that has a very high view of God's sovereignty in all matters, including painful ones. And that really carried me through. In a lot of ways, I referred to the Puritans earlier, whose theology I would tend to line up with in a lot of ways. That was a big part of carrying us through it, I think, and me being able to shepherd my family in that way and try to shepherd those in a much more nuanced, delicate way who were struggling with what God had, fill in the blank, ordained, allowed to happen.
Mm-hmm.
When the smoke cleared on all that, it was probably 2 to 3 months later, I still felt like the call to the Hui was there. I just couldn't see how we'd be able to be helpful on that front. So I thought in terms of diaspora efforts, but the fact is the Hui don't particularly run on those tracks. So, I mean, you'll find some in a few places around China, but they're not like other minority groups that are very active in large numbers in significant cities throughout the globe. The Hui pretty much like to stay on the mainland. They have a bit of an island or bunker mentality because the only thing that separates them from becoming Han, from becoming Haram, is their Islamic faith. And so they try not to separate and allow themselves to be diluted by geographical separation. So there wasn't a lot of options. I started thinking about maybe I'll work with, Pakistanis or something like that. I started thinking about maybe I'm going to have to learn another language and this sort of thing, or even just trying to encourage the Chinese church from the outside somehow. But I couldn't shake that sense of continued connection to the Hui work. And so that's really what we prayed toward. There were opportunities to, become a pastor at really healthy churches that were in need of a pastor, or to work at Great Commission organization bases or these kinds of things. But we just felt like we felt like he wasn't done with us yet on the Hui front.
We're talking this week on Voice of the Martyrs Radio with Brother Kevin. He is a gospel worker who spent more than a decade among a Muslim people group in China. Kevin, your situation having to leave the country is not unique. Unfortunately, lots of foreigners have had to do that. How are the Hui people in China being reached now that so many gospel workers like you have had to leave?
I think this is where what comes to mind for me is to recognize how missions is changing in the world. There are avenues for gospel outreach that were just not available 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, and in some ways even 5 years ago. And I think what I really praise God for is the efforts to see churches planted among the Hui has become much more multifaceted in the last 5-6 years than it was before 2018. I think prior to 2018, you're looking at mostly traditional residential church planting approaches. And I think generally the foreign community has recognized that we are probably not going to be the people on the front line for that it's going to be probably Han Chinese believers that are going to lead the way on that, and potentially workers that are coming from other countries rather than Western passport countries. So one of the things I'm really excited about is how God has given his people wisdom to use media platforms to make gospel content available to Hui Muslims on their devices. The anonymity factor is pretty big for the Hui because of that face aspect. They don't want to disappoint their parents. They don't want to enrage the uncle. They don't want the imam to get involved. So the fact that they can look at things on their phone or on their computer really opens a door for much deeper experience with the things of Christ than would be possible if they were entirely dependent on, your typical 6'5" Caucasian missionary from Australia or something.
Yeah. Kevin, as we finish up, we always like to equip listeners to pray. So let's talk about God's work among the Hui people. We talked about the media work that's going on. What are some specific ways that we can pray for the Lord to continue moving among the Hui?
First thing that comes to mind, I think, would be for the Lord to visit Hui families with dreams, with visions, with divine appointments where they meet a Han Chinese believer, a Korean believer. They meet a foreign teacher who knows Christ. They get to hear a testimony. They go online and search and they hear something in their language that reflects the reality of the gospel. Those kinds of divine appointments or revelations, I think, are really key. We saw that a lot from people that they had some kind of a touch from God, either directly in a dream or a vision, or through one of God's people that had prepared the way for fruitful gospel discussions. And I think just praying for that to happen. I think we have to pray for our Han Chinese brothers and sisters. It's a tough situation they're in. In a sense, they're sandwiched between almost unlimited opportunities to reach the unreached with their passport. They don't even need a passport, just with their ID card. They can go to them easily. So I think just for God's courage to fill them and to envelop them, for them to be preaching the cross and not just alleviation of your sufferings or prosperity, but preaching reconciliation to the Creator God, and that experience of knowing Him transcends whatever the circumstantial hardships are, which are inevitably coming our way.
Amen. Kevin, thank you for your service for the gospel. Thank you for being our guest this week on Voice of the Martyrs Radio.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
It has been our pleasure. You are listening to the Voice of the Martyrs Radio. If you are just joining us, you will want to go online to vomradio.net. You'll want to hear this whole conversation with Brother Kevin. And I hope you'll pray for God's work among the Hui people, especially this week. I would love to hear from you. There's a message bar at vomradio.net. Send me a note. Let me know that you are praying for the Hui people, that you're praying for the nation of China. And join us again next week as we continue to discuss what God is doing around the world, especially in hostile and restricted nations, right here on the Voice of the Martyrs Radio Network.